We're back with a very special episode of Nuke Talk, our inaugural special report. As of January 20th, 2025, Donald J. Trump has once again been sworn in as the President of the United States, marking the beginning of his second term in office. Throughout this season of the podcast, we've taken you on a deep dive into the nuclear ballot, examining how the outcome of the 2024 U.S. presidential election could shape nuclear weapons policy, as well as broader domestic and foreign policy. We analyzed scenarios for both major candidates and unpacked their potential impacts on everything from NATO alliances to U.S.-China relations and global arms control efforts. And now we find ourselves in one of those realities, a second Trump presidency. So what exactly does this mean for the future of U.S. nuclear weapons policy? How might it influence the delicate balance of global power, the arms control landscape or lack thereof, and America's role in addressing nuclear threats? Moreover, what ripple effects could we expect here, at home and abroad? How will this presidency shape the fabric of domestic and foreign policy as we navigate a world increasingly defined by geopolitical tension? Let's dive into it. I'm just going to have you start by introducing yourself.
Sure. My name's Jon Wolfsthal. I'm the Director of Global Risk at the Federation of American Scientists.
And thank you for joining us today. Okay, starting right into a recap, so to speak. So Trump is now, at the time of people listening, the 47th President of the United States. For listeners who might need a refresher, how would you summarize his first term in terms of nuclear policy, domestic policy, and foreign policy?
Well, first of all, anybody who needs a refresher, I envy them because the first term of President Trump, I think, remains as a pinnacle of both chaotic and disruptive leadership. And I think based on what we know, we can expect more of the same. President Trump acted in a very instinctive, reflexive way. He has very strong views. I don't think they've evolved very much since he was very young in New York. I grew up in New York when he was coming up, and he tends to basically be all ego. On the nuclear front, it was interesting. In some ways, he leaned into very traditional, conservative establishment nuclear views. Large increases and investments in the U.S. nuclear arsenal, a heavy willingness to talk about nuclear use as a virtue almost. That, remember, he threatened nuclear use not only against North Korea, talking up the size of his button compared to Kim Jong-un's, talked about using nuclear weapons against Iran, even threatened to use nuclear weapons against Afghanistan and a hurricane. But then also did very unconventional things. His courtship with Kim Jong-un, his 2 summit meetings, which didn't pan out largely because he couldn't control his own administration and didn't know how to actually take ideas and turn it into policy, I think is an important element here to keep in mind. So what President Trump says comes from him, but his ability to actually make it happen is very limited. What will be curious in this term in office is whether or not the people around him, many of whom served in the first administration, are more capable, are more unified, and actually able to implement policy in a cohesive way. I still have my doubts, and I think there's a double-edged problem here. One is Trump doesn't really know how to control the government, and the government doesn't really know how to control Donald Trump. So, for example, I think the biggest disconnect in this administration is going to be over China. Donald Trump has talked tough about China. He's brought in a number of people, National Security Advisor Waltz, Elbridge Colby at Defense Undersecretary, who really believe the United States needs to take on China to protect Taiwan and to outpace what people see as the main strategic competitor. I don't believe Donald Trump has any interest or willingness to confront China in a serious way. I think if China were to attack Taiwan, Donald Trump would not come to their defense. He's already indicated that that is likely to be the case. So I think it's a very difficult, dangerous time, and one, quite frankly, that I think is going to be marked by chaos.
How has his policy kind of evolved and shifted since leaving office? What has he said on the campaign trail after winning the election? And what are his picks for secretaries and political appointees? How is that signaling a possible shift or a lack thereof?
I think there are 2 hallmarks for most of what is going to happen in this administration. The first is Donald Trump is not picking people based on their ideology or experience or content. He's picking people based on two things. Are they good on Fox News? And can they make him money? I think the second reality here is that he is picking people that don't have very much experience in what they are asked to do. The nominee for Secretary of Defense has no experience running a large organization, let alone the largest employer in the United States and the biggest budget item in the United States. No idea how to handle complex issue of geostrategy or of procurement. A successful Secretary of Defense can have either. He has neither. There are good people underneath him. I don't agree with Elbridge Colby, but he's a fully knowledgeable, competent, capable person for Undersecretary of Defense. How long he lasts remains to be seen. He intellectually doesn't have a lot in common with, say, Marco Rubio. Lee Zeldin, as the head of EPA, doesn't have much experience in environmental issues. So, I think he's filling roles almost like a casting director. They look good, right? This is what he said early on. He looks like a Secretary of Defense. He looks like a Secretary of State. So I don't think there's really much cohesiveness to it. In terms of what Donald Trump has said, he's been all over the map. We're going to get tough with China, but I'm not sure I'm going to come to the defense of Taiwan. We can have a good relationship with Russia, but they better end the war in Ukraine quickly or else. So I don't think there's any intellectual cohesiveness to what Donald Trump thinks. He's a complete chameleon. TikTok's a great example, right? So, China is a national security threat. We have to ban TikTok. Oh, no, I'm going to write an executive order that's going to keep them in place. There's no predictability or stability to what Donald Trump is doing, which again, I think gets to my first point about this being a very chaotic period.
During his first term, the chaos and this element of he kind of doesn't have a hard stance on anything, right? That did plague him in terms of not being able to do a lot of policy implications because it was just a limit of who he was surrounding himself with, constant turnovers. To your note, he is kind of picking people based off who he thinks look good or who appears well on Fox News. How is this structure, do you think, looking really at DOD, for example, how could this structure kind of implode in terms of implementing strategy that is in Project 2025 when it comes to nuclear?
Well, one, it's probably worth taking a step back that people around Donald Trump fall into two categories. The truly deluded who think that they can influence or control Trump. He has demonstrated that he's prepared to cut off anybody at the knees if they get too big for their britches, if they act in ways that he doesn't believe, or he just gets bored with them, right? Donald Trump wants the attention. And so if you look at his chiefs of staff, his press spokesman, he's shown a willingness to just sort of burn through these people. So the first category is people who just think that they're going to be influenced. The second group I think are very smart. And they're the ones who know that if they operate below the radar, they can do a lot. They can do a lot for themselves. They can do a lot to implement their own agenda as long as they don't get crosswise with Donald Trump. And they can build little sort of power centers. So Stephen Miller is the best at this, right? His ability to influence immigration policy, economic policy is, I think, dangerous, but effective. People who are filling the Trump administration, I think, are going to try to implement the 2025 recommendations from Heritage, which talk about accelerating and expanding the U.S. nuclear buildup. And I think that's something that Trump is fine doing. It's not his money, right? If Congress is willing to fund it, that he's willing to authorize it. To be honest, that's no different than under Democratic administrations. We've been seeing the expansion of this budget. The difference here is that there's not much expansion ability left. We are burning money. I mean, the ICBM program, the long-range missile program, the Sentinel, is almost 100% over budget, 5 years behind schedule, and no amount of money is going to fix that problem. The submarine program is running into its own problems, even though the Pentagon's been touting the Air Force's B-21 bomber being ahead of schedule under budget. That budget's classified, so nobody really knows if they're telling the truth or not. So there's just a limited amount to what they can do to move these programs up. But it is clear they are going to try to lock in new programs, both the new Sea-launched cruise missile with nuclear weapons, try to accelerate the purchasing of bombers and submarines and ICBMs, and commit the U.S. to contracts so that even if things go over budget and the timelines stretch out, that the next president, assuming we have one, won't be able to undo those programs. And I think that's where we're likely to see sort of an interesting intellectual question come up. There are people who really want to cut the size of the federal budget, right? The DOGE effort under Elon Musk. There are a number of nuclear programs and defense programs that are way over budget and, quite frankly, are not really well suited to today's geostrategic situation. I was having a conversation with somebody this week about aircraft carriers, right? Why do we need multi-billion-dollar, very large, slow-moving manned fighter bomber aircraft carriers, when what we really need are small, expendable drone carriers that can be built for tens of millions of dollars, and you can build lots of them. We're locked into these legacy programs, which are natural areas to cut. I don't think Donald Trump's going to get there. I think he's just going to burn through money, and I think a Republican Congress is likely to keep authorizing ever-increasing amounts. I think we're likely to see the first $1 trillion defense budget over the next couple of years, which is not consistent with how Donald Trump has talked, but it is consistent with how the people underneath him see the geostrategic situation.
Really kind of going back to your point about this chaos model, and we don't really know what to expect. Some have kind of coined the first term to expect the unexpected, right, when it came to Trump. So what are some, given your background and given what we all saw during the first term, what are some potential surprises or developments that you think we might see in a second term, even when it comes to domestic or foreign policy?
I used to work for President Joe Biden when he was vice president. He only yelled at me twice. One, I wrote a speech he didn't like. And the second is I gave him political advice. And he said, look, you may be really smart on nuclear, but you don't know jack on domestic politics. So that's my job. So I hesitate to sort of, suggest on the domestic front what might come to pass. On the international side, I will tell you, and I think we have a responsibility to look out more than just next week or next month. I think the next 4 years are incredibly dangerous for the United States. If you are a U.S. adversary, China, Russia, North Korea, and you're looking at Donald Trump in his last term, and you know that he can either be bought or intimidated, or you can stoke his personal aversion to actually standing up for allies, I think the potential for snatch and grab territory is very real. I don't think China has committed itself to seizing Taiwan, but I think they're going to have to ask themselves, is the second Trump administration a real opportunity to do that where they might not otherwise? How does North Korea respond to President Trump and his aversion to standing up for allies? Does it decide now's the time to really test South Korea's ability to hold territory? How does Russia really think about NATO? If it wants to go for the rest of Ukraine, if it wants to move into Moldova, Georgia, if it wants to think about territory in Europe, is now, over the next 4 years, the time to really push that? I don't know the answer, but I worry about it a lot. And I know U.S. allies worry about it a lot. And I think that can lead to all number of surprises, including, one I worry about a lot, a decision by U.S. allies to acquire nuclear weapons of their own, independent nuclear weapons, and also how Iran is going to behave in this period. I don't think Donald Trump is prepared to initiate military conflict to prevent Iran from doing anything. Israel would like to convince the United States to do so. I don't think the Bibi-Trump relationship is everything that people think it is. And so I think you're likely to see increased volatility, increased efforts to coerce and blackmail the United States, and even a willingness of U.S. adversaries to test their luck under President Trump.
And do you think in that vein, we also might see the U.S. really consider nuclear testing? And what would that mean if the U.S. were to test nuclear weapons with other nuclear weapon states, whether it's Russia or China, possibly considering, if the U.S. is doing it, why don't we?
Yeah. So former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien has written that the U.S. should resume nuclear testing, not because we need to from a technical basis, but to demonstrate our resolve and the effectiveness of our nuclear weapons, which is one of the dumber ideas I've heard. No U.S. adversary doubts the ability of our nuclear weapons to detonate and explode, even though I think as U.S. nuclear weapons age, we do have a responsibility to maintain their effectiveness, and we do that very effectively through science-based stockpile stewardship. The U.S. nuclear laboratory directors have stated that we know more about how our nuclear weapons work now than when we used to explosively test nuclear weapons, so technically there's no need to test. If the United States wanted to test nuclear weapons, I think there are two major considerations. One is, domestically, it's a really stupid idea because testing nuclear weapons in Nevada is a really good way to make sure that Nevada rejects the party in power and goes the other way. And so I think there's a domestic political reality here that is just being ignored. I don't think President Trump, knowing Nevada is important to politics, is going to start testing. Now, that being said, he's not going to reign in office through an election. And so he may not care about that, but domestically, I think it's unlikely to happen. However, if the United States were to test nuclear weapons, I think it would just open the door for Russia and China to follow suit. And this gets to an issue that we've talked about on my own podcast, We're All Gonna Die Radio, a number of times, which is that the United States conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests, very well instrumented. So we have a very good sense of the codes and the technology needed to maintain and even develop new nuclear weapons without testing. Russia did fewer tests and they weren't well calibrated or instrumented. And so they would benefit significantly from new nuclear tests. And China conducted a handful and they would really benefit. So all that the United States would do is demonstrate that it has a lack of confidence in the reliability of its own nuclear weapons, and then would open the door for China and Russia to basically close the gap in their ability to build and design new nuclear weapons.
During Trump's first term, there's a lot of focus on the nuclear football and Trump having his finger on the button. Now that we're back to a Trump presidency, can you remind people, for those who may have the blissful ignorance of forgetting what that is, what is the nuclear football? And then also what it means for the U.S. when a president has authority to launch a nuclear weapon without a lot of people stepping in?
So I routinely disappoint people when I describe the nuclear football. So the president is the only person in the United States who can authorize the use of nuclear weapons, either in response to an attack or through first use. To do that, he needs to have the plans and the communication equipment to be able to order that strike. And so people think it's a really cool briefcase, and you pull out of it this souped-up laptop with a red button, and it has the radar circle going around. And in fact, it's a 3-ring binder, probably made by, the same people that made your, Trapper Keeper not your Trapper Keeper, but my Trapper Keeper in middle school, and a telephone. And the military aide, usually a Navy commander, is there to walk the president through these different strike options so that the president can, if he wants to, pick up the phone, use what's known as the biscuit, basically a laminated card with an authorization code, to call the Pentagon and authorize the use of nuclear weapons. And he would have to do that by corresponding to the laminated sheets in his Trapper Keeper notebook. So the football travels with the president everywhere. It's basically right outside his door when he sleeps. It's on Air Force One and Marine One when he travels. And if you look at pictures of the president, you'll often see a Navy officer carrying a big oversized leather briefcase. And there are a few of them. Actually, they sort of swap in and out. Because the president is the legal authority in the United States to authorize nuclear weapons, you also have this really anachronistic reality that the president can do so without having to get permission or the okay from anybody else. So most people don't know that the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, are not in the nuclear chain of command. For any other use of military force, if the president wants to send SEAL Team 6 into the field, if he wants to fire a cruise missile, if he wants to have U.S. troops fire across the U.S. border to kill somebody coming in from Canada or Mexico, he needs to relay that order in writing to the Secretary of Defense, who then communicates it to the combatant commander. The president, however, for nuclear weapons can pick up the phone, call the Nuclear Watch Center at the Pentagon, it's usually staffed by a colonel, give them the code, and those orders go. The Secretary of Defense might not even know about it. The Secretary of State might not even know about it. The Vice President might not even know about it. And the president can also order the colonel at the Watch Center to say, don't tell anybody up your chain of command. So this was such a concern that in January of 2021, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi wrote to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley and asked whether or not Donald Trump could use nuclear weapons, could actually employ nuclear weapons to try to remain in power, and what were the safeguards to control that. And Mark Milley, in an ad hoc way, inserted himself into the nuclear chain of command, told his watch officers that he had to be told of any nuclear authorization by the president. So those safeguards don't exist formally, and the President Trump now has that authority again. So I think there is real concern that in a crisis, for political reasons, or should what some people think is a medical instability on the part of the president manifest itself, it could be a major concern. Now, people in the Pentagon, people in Strategic Command, people in the military are also aware of these risks. They are extremely, extremely conservative by nature and among the most patriotic Americans and don't want to see nuclear weapons abused. And so I'm sure that there are additional safeguards that are being talked about and maybe even implemented, but they are not going to come from the top. So General Cotton, I'm sure, is talking about this with his own team, but I don't expect people like Bridge Colby or Secretary Hegseth or National Security Advisor Waltz to implement those from above. And so we're going to have to rely on a combination of goodwill and good luck to make sure that this risk doesn't come to pass.
The final big question to end this, which I think you have hinted at a lot throughout this interview, is with Trump back in office, where do you see the U.S. nuclear policy heading in the coming years? And what scares you about this?
Well, again, remember, I run a podcast called We're All Gonna Die, so I'm scared by a lot of things. Although, to be fair, it's true, we're all gonna die at some point. But I think there's an interesting question, which intellectually I'm sort of focused on, and then I'll talk to you about what really worries me. The United States maintains about 3,700 nuclear weapons in its arsenal. It has been known for a long time that the three reasons we have nuclear weapons are to deter strategic attack by others, to reassure our allies, and if necessary, to respond to an attack with nuclear weapons. We don't need very many weapons to deter Russia or China from using nuclear weapons against us. Even senior military leaders have said that might only be a few hundred weapons, 3, 5, 6, 700. That's enough to destroy a society in minutes. And to respond to a nuclear strike, the United States also does not need massive amount of nuclear weapons. That might be only 500 or 1,000. We maintain a much larger nuclear arsenal because that is what is seen as necessary to reassure our allies that we can deter our adversaries and that we can come to their aid and defense. Donald Trump doesn't care about our allies. He doesn't care about our alliance. He doesn't care about NATO, thinks it's an extortion racket, doesn't really think South Korea or Japan are worth defending. And so if we don't really care about our allies, why are we spending $50 billion a year on a lot more nuclear weapons than we need to deter or to actually fight a nuclear war? It's a really, I think, critical question, which might actually provide an opportunity to reduce the amount of money we spend on nuclear weapons while still maintaining a very effective deterrent. Now, I actually support our allies and I support our alliances, but I also think we should be leaning into our conventional capability, our economic power, our cultural and political ties, and our people-to-people ties in a way that's much more credible than our nuclear weapons. But that's not Donald Trump's approach, and that's not going to happen. I've hinted at what really scares me, which is not that the United States is going to precipitate a war. It is this impression that somehow we are projecting strength through America First and MAGA, when in fact our adversaries know that Donald Trump is a bully who will back down, that he will not stand up for our interests, or that it can be bought. So, for example, what I have speculated to other people is that I can imagine President Xi of China telling Donald Trump very bluntly, look, Taiwan is part of China. It's always been part of China, and it's going to be again. But I don't want to fight a war over it. The Taiwanese will come along. We might have to send police there, and we're going to have to, show them that we can protect them. But that's an internal matter, as the Chinese have said. We could go to war over that. But if we did that, I wouldn't be able to offer you the exclusive rights to build hotels in Shanghai and Beijing for the next 20 years, which I would really like to do. So can't we work out a deal? And Donald Trump jumps at that chance 7 times a week and twice on Sunday. Because we know that he's a transparent, transactional person looking to exploit his position for financial gain. And so I think that risk that we will see adversaries take advantage of, I don't take any pride in saying this, feckless American leadership under Donald Trump really worries me, because I think we were able to recover from the first Trump administration because our adversaries did not truly take advantage of Donald Trump and his approach to the world, but I don't think we're going to get that lucky again.
Well, on that positive note, Jon, thank you for joining us today.
Always happy to cheer everybody up. That's my job.
Thank you to Jon for joining us on this episode, and a heartfelt thank you to all of our listeners for being with us throughout this season. With that, we are officially closing the book on this latest season, The Nuclear Ballot. Thank you for joining in and listening each week, and for being engaged and eager to ask about what's next regarding this issue. And with that, it's your host, Angela Kellett, signing off.